This is episode 17 of the Progression Health podcast, and I'm here with researcher Kate Dawson. Kate, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, okay. Thanks, Ross, for having me. My name is Dr. Kate Dawson. I work for the Active Consent Program in the School of Psychology. Finished my PhD about 2 years ago that focused around pornography and sex education. Currently working on developing a online sexual media literacy intervention for teenagers, but a lot of my work focuses on consent interventions as well, and looking at kind of developing large scale studies to look at sort of experiences of consent or sexual violence in the general population among young adults. My background is in sex ed, so I worked as a sex educator for 6 or 7 years, I think 7 years maybe. So yeah, that's kind of me in a nutshell.
Very good. So what initially led you to this area of research? It's not the kind of the common path in academics.
Yeah, I suppose not. Well, my undergrad, I focused primarily on European law in UL, and really found like it was just not for me at all. I completely disengaged from it. I wasn't interested in it whatsoever. But as part of co-op, like this placement that you get to do when you're in UL, I got to go to Ghana for 6 months, and the village that I was working in, there were really high rates of HIV in the population, and there were also loads of teenage pregnancies. So like for a lot of the girls, most of them wouldn't get to what we would call maybe third year in secondary school, because they would get pregnant and then they'd have to leave school, whereas most of the boys would stay on. So I became interested in that, and I started kind of doing like sex education discussion groups after school, and making like with the girls and getting them aware of, you know, a lot of them didn't really know how they could get pregnant either. So started doing kind of teenage pregnancy awareness and HIV prevention workshops there, and realized that I really loved it. I loved just working in that area. So I came back after that, and then went on to the master's in public health or in health promotion in NUIG, and had no real intention actually of doing a PhD, but I emailed somebody saying that I was kind of interested in, for my master's research, I did a study on the link between porn use and genital self-image. So how much porn you watch, how does it make you feel about your genitals? I was really interested in that, so I emailed who ended up being my PhD supervisor to be like, oh, I'm kind of interested in sexual health. I know you're doing some research in psychology. Is there any way, you know, is there any space for me as a research assistant? And then Padraig said, you know what, there's actually a PhD deadline or application deadline in 2 days if you want to put an application together and put it in. So I did, and not thinking that I would get it at all. And I got it. So here I am. Yeah, 6 years later, having finished my PhD, I'm now my second postdoc, and yeah, loving it.
Wow, that's some story. So just in your master's research project, what did you find in that? What was the kind of, did you find anything of significance or?
Yeah. So like going back now, what I'd love to do is actually repeat that study, knowing what I know now. You know, it's like at the time I didn't really have that much training with regard to like, you know, methodologies or statistical analysis. So the analysis I did was quite basic. But what we found was that your motivation for porn use is really important into how that's going to affect how you feel. So if you're watching it just to masturbate, so just for sexual arousal, or even with your partner in order to, you know, to like explore new things with your partner, for most people that will have positive implications with regard to how they feel about their genitals. So it might be that they associate watching porn with having an orgasm or being able to get like sexually excited. So a lot of people consider that a good thing. But then on the other hand, one thing that came up as a significant finding was people who use porn as a source of sexual information or a source of sex education, they were more likely to feel bad about their genitals. Now, it was a cross-sectional correlational study. So it's, you know, data collected at one point in time. So we don't know which direction, you know, that our findings are going in. But I suppose it kind of makes sense. And, you know, some of my studies that I've published recently go into this in a lot more detail. I mean, I think for anybody, if porn becomes your only point of reference for sex, or, you know, it's your main source of information, it might, depending on the porn that you're watching, yes, there is some really inclusive, varied, porn, but the large majority of free, accessible mainstream porn that young people are watching is kind of portrays like standard, sort of idealized bodies, where slim white women with large breasts, men with larger than average penises, nobody has any pubic hair. Some people, a lot of people wouldn't have any pubic hair. A lot of people's genitals wouldn't reflect maybe the average. So if that's a place that you're going to get your information, and then you're looking at your own body, of course you might think that there's a discrepancy there. Whereas what I also think, though, that we can't blame porn for being like that. It's just porn. We don't give film and TV the same sort of slack that we give porn. You're like, oh, the relationships that you see in TV are so unrealistic. You don't watch The Notebook and you're like, oh, they shouldn't be showing these glorified, beautiful couples having this happy ever after. That's not what real relationships are like. But we do that for porn, and we give out about it all the time. But we don't do that for movies, because we can contextualize information, about relationships, because we all have relationships, we see relationships. But when it comes to sex, or like movies about sex, porn, we don't have a point of reference. And that's really the issue when it comes to, needing to talk about porn when it comes to sex education, because you don't get to see sex anywhere else, and you see it in porn. So for a lot of young, sexually inexperienced, naturally curious people, of course they're going to go to that. Why wouldn't you? If you're worried about being good in bed, oh, where can I find that out? Of course you're going to go to porn to look at, okay, maybe this is how I give a hand job. Maybe this is how I do whatever. But it's up to us then to, educate young people that, okay, totally normal to be curious about sex. And if watching porn is something you want to do, that's your decision. But don't let it influence, your behavior or how you think about yourself or how you think about other people, because it's completely unreliable as a source of information, really. Anyway.
Absolutely, yeah. So kind of jumping ahead, I guess. So is porn, are the effects of viewing porn, and I guess it really depends on the person who's watching it as well, but are they negative? Is it worse than people think? What's really, what does research say about the effects of porn, basically?
So there's no one size fits all when it comes to porn. It really depends on, as you said, the type of predispositions that you have, the type of content that you watch, when you see it for the first time. If you're predisposed to aggression, so you have aggressive tendencies, you might have a history of bullying, or getting in fights, or sort of having these maybe callous unemotional traits, and you have a tendency towards aggression, you're more likely, we know from the literature, that a person would be more likely to seek out and watch what we might call violent or aggressive porn, and they're more kind of accepting of it. So it's sort of, in that situation or in that context, porn can reinforce existing beliefs that they have about violence. They already think that violence isn't that much of a big deal, so then they might see violent behavior, not just in porn, but in video games and TV, anywhere, and think oh yeah, that aligns with how I think, so it's just going to reinforce them in that regard. Same with body image issues. If somebody has body dysphoria, or they have some major concerns about their bodies, they might compare themselves with every person that they see in the media. So if they're looking on Instagram, at weightlifting models or whatever, they're going to kind of compare themselves to those bodies. Same thing if they watch porn and they're seeing a certain type of body type as well. So porn, what we know from the literature is that on its own, porn isn't going to cause any real problems for the vast majority of people. It can reinforce some existing problems, sure, definitely. But say for a teenager, if it's not an aggressive teenager, if they see they come across a violent porn scene, it's not going to all of a sudden make them go out and sexually assault somebody. But there is, I suppose, where it can kind of become a bit more complicated is the amount that somebody really relies on porn, you know. So there's this, I suppose, what people might call porn addiction. But us, just with our researcher hats on, we're slow to call it an addiction, because it doesn't kind of the brain doesn't respond to porn in the same way that it does to, you know, gambling or alcohol or drug use for people who are addicted to those things. So there's basically a brain, so the brain there's something called the P300, which is like a neural network in the brain, and that becomes activated in people who, say, if you're addicted to alcohol, P300 will become activated if you talk about alcohol, or if you see alcohol and you're addicted to it. Same thing doesn't happen for porn. So we can't say that the two models aren't the same. Definitely people can become reliant on porn, and I think that's what people mean when they say porn addiction, but I'm probably just being a bit too pedantic about this. But yes, people can absolutely become reliant on it. And for some people, you know, that's fine. If it's not bothering you, then that's okay. You know, really, how you define a dysfunction is really up to you. If it's a problem to you, then it's problematic. But if it's not, then it's not. But then a lot of people might feel morally sort of maybe disturbed by the fact that they're finding it really difficult to cut down their porn use. And what's interesting is that normally people who have more conservative backgrounds are more likely to say that they're addicted to porn, than those who are actually more accepting and have kind of broader or more liberal sexual values. So it's interesting in that, say, if you have a religious or a conservative background, maybe you're more likely just to say that your porn use feels out of control, even if it may not necessarily be out of control at all. So yeah, like as I was saying, that there's no, you know, one size fits all with this. We know that it's associated with lots of things, you know, depending on the content that you watch. So for young people, if they watch a lot of mainstream porn that has, you know, the sort of dominant man and submissive woman, these can sort of reinforce ideas about traditional gender roles, you know, that the guy needs to be the one to get the girl and the girl needs to kind of play coy and give in to the man's advances. But for the most part, you know, what's interesting, we're kind of living in an interesting time now, because there are people who have grown up without porn and watch it now, and if, you know, it doesn't influence them in any way at all. You know, maybe they get some ideas, or they're kind of exposed to something that they didn't know that they were kind of turned on by in the past, or that they are turned on by. But we're at a stage now where, yes, a lot of children, teenagers are watching porn, or they're, you know, maybe watching it intentionally or watching it unintentionally, or being shown it by their friends. We don't know what the implications of that are going to be, really. And it's very difficult to assess that long term. You know, if we want to, yes, we can do retrospective studies, and, you know, I can ask you, because you're an adult, oh, like, what age did you start watching porn, or what age did you first see porn? And we can ask those types of questions in surveys, but we can't ask children about their pornography use, because that would be completely unethical. So we're kind of left sort of having to do these retrospective studies. And we'll have a lot more information, you know, as time goes on.
Yeah, I feel like we're sort of early adopters of this, you know, the time we're in, the digital age we're in, where like social media as well, and porn, and there's no kind of rule book or guidelines at all. So it's kind of just like an ongoing experiment, and we'll only figure out the results, you know, later on down the line. But is there any sort of, I don't know, I guess, any research-based things to do in terms of watching porn, and things not to do, like maybe a certain age, or any kind of things in the research that, you know, ways to interact with it for maybe your mental health, or for your well-being?
You know, definitely. Like, I suppose it's kind of like anything, you know, if you're, so when I worked in sex education, we would usually talk about these 3 golden rules for masturbation, and they kind of apply to porn use as well, because most of the time porn use accompanies masturbation. But the first would be that you're not masturbating so much that you're hurting yourself. You're not masturbating so much that it's interfering with your everyday life. And then the last one was you're not masturbating so much that, what was the last one? Interfering with your everyday life.
Would it be relationships, that it's not interfering with your relationships?
No, it's not that one, because it's all to do with personal use. Why can't I think of that? Oh my God, I used to say it all the time. It'll come back to me. But it's, as long as it's not interfering with your life, or it's not having a negative effect on your life, or your relationships. And that can be a tricky one, because for some people they might really enjoy watching porn. Maybe it's the only way that they can masturbate or that they can kind of orgasm, but their partner might have an issue with that. The partner might some people see it as infidelity, other people don't. People have really differing views when it comes to porn use. But generally, if you're not, if you don't feel a compulsion to watch it, if you feel like you can go without it, then that's good. Then it means you have a healthy relationship with it. If you feel like you can't go without it, then it might mean that you need to try to take a break from it. A lot of people researchers would sort of say to take a 6-week break if possible, but I don't know how much evidence there is to back that up, kind of like breaking a cycle. And it's kind of difficult to know where to go in Ireland anyway to get support, if you're having problems with what you might call porn addiction, or you're reliant on it. And a lot of the sort of programs that aim to kind of get people through porn addiction and to get them out of it, they're sort of tied with religious organizations, so it's complicated. But as long as it's obviously not interfering with your everyday life, don't feel like you're exceptionally reliant on it, and as well that you're not watching any illegal content. If you feel like you're being drawn to illegal content, that being anything that features children, anything that features animals, and then obviously certain kind of extreme behaviors. Now, people might be surprised that certain behaviors aren't illegal, but it's really a moral debate about what you're comfortable with. But if it's actually an illegal thing to film, then that's something you need to consider as well. And obviously, if you're finding that you're kind of veering more and more towards very violent, very forceful content, there's a difference between aggressive consensual sex, and aggressive non-consensual sex or violent sex. Where someone is being forced to do something is not the same as someone being spanked, even though they both might be understood as like aggressive per se. But if you find that you're trying to find content that's unregulated and that wouldn't be on mainstream sites, that would be an issue as well. And to try to get some counseling or some help about it, because a lot of people might have these issues or thoughts and they just don't know where to go, and they might be really embarrassed because it's to do with sex, and people are just awkward when it comes to talking about sex in general. But now I think more than ever, it's a lot easier to access people in different countries. So just because you live in Ireland and you have you're struggling with your pornography use, there are excellent sex therapists in the UK and Australia and the States that you can do a Zoom call with now, that maybe we mightn't have considered in the past, just because we're limited here, with regard to kind of sex therapists and that kind of thing. There are a few, but there aren't that many. You can go further afield and do it that way. So definitely don't, I suppose, for people that shouldn't feel stuck. Oh, cat falling off the couch here, sorry. Yeah.
Got it. Yeah, I was going to say, what are the services available for people if they wanted to talk about it? Because I feel like it's very taboo to talk about, but I don't know, what are the statistics of adults that watch porn? Do you know any idea? Because I feel like it would be, a lot higher than, most people. Yeah.
Oh yeah, young. So it tapers off. Kind of, you have to contextualize it really. Young adults watch loads of it. People in relationships watch less than people who aren't in relationships. As you get older, you watch less. But most people watch it. I did a study a couple of years ago. I think we had maybe 2,000 participants from NUIG, and I think it was like 97% watch porn. Well, maybe they don't watch it regularly, but they had seen it. And some would say that they watch it a lot. But like 70% of young men watch porn at least once a week, in Ireland anyway. So yeah, people watch it a lot. Like, and that changes, depending on what's going on in your life. And you know yourself, like if you're stressed, you might be less likely to go and exercise. If you're stressed, you might be less likely to feel like you want to masturbate and watch porn. So it really varies, but a lot of adults, all over the world will watch porn.
Yeah, basically, the majority of people do watch it. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then what I hear people saying is like the more they watch it, the more progressive it gets. So they watch like, I don't know, softcore.
Do you mean like the kind of slippery slope?
Yeah, I've heard people say this where it's like, I feel like it's people who watch it very regularly, like, multiple times a week, and they're kind of reminds me of like almost like coffee or something. Someone who drinks coffee, they need more coffee to get the same awake type of feeling. So people who watch porn more regularly, they need to watch a different type or more, they go from softcore to hardcore to get the same, I don't know, thrill from it. Is that true?
No, so it's not necessarily true for the vast majority of people. I suppose now we don't really have the luxury of, looking at studies where we can say, oh, they started off on softcore, because nobody looks at softcore anymore. Like nobody's going to buy a magazine, and, that's just non-existent anymore. So all porn is hardcore porn. But with regard to kind of variety and stuff, it doesn't, yes, people want variety, same with the way that you want variety in your life and all the other aspects. You're not going to have chicken and rice for every meal that you have. You want variety, like trying new food. It's the same with your kind of sexual appetite, I guess. Just because you like watching oral sex doesn't mean that you're going to end up watching absolutely bananas stuff down the line. You might end up broadening your understanding of what you're interested in, and a lot of people say that the porn has kind of helped them to do that in some cases. But for a lot of people, they'll kind of stick to the same, they're not going to watch the same video over and over again, that's for sure. But this whole kind of slippery slope thing, it's not really backed up by evidence. So there's no evidence to show that if you start watching, boyfriend and a girlfriend having, slow consensual sex, that if you watch it every day, you're going to end up watching something really extreme and really violent. That doesn't happen. For people who are typically functioning and they don't have any kind of predispositions to aggression or any kind of maybe psychological problems that would lead them to choose content that a lot of people might find really disturbing. So I've lost my train of thought now. What was I saying?
The progressiveness of porn, and they start kind of soft.
Thank you. It's like cat kind of clawed my foot, and I was like, oh gosh. Okay. So like there's people often make that claim for whatever reason. You'd hear that in the news a lot, but it's not founded on any research evidence. There's I think it was a study that was released a couple of years ago by Short and Seda, maybe 2018, 2019. That there hasn't been this increase in demand for more violent porn, and if that was, and that's from a content analysis of all of the top Pornhub videos over the last decade or something like that. And if there was an increase in demand, we'd see it in the type of porn that's being made. So if more people were needing more and more extreme stuff, we'd be seeing more and more extreme stuff being hosted on Pornhub, and that's not happening.
Good to hear. You wouldn't like to think that's happening. So in terms of like sexual education, is porn where a lot of people learn about sexual education, and is it like a useful tool for sexual education, or what would your opinion be? Or
it is not useful for young people. It's not useful as an educator for somebody who doesn't have any knowledge about sex. It's really it's great then for other people who want to explore their sexuality. And I'm not saying that all porn is bad, definitely not. But it's not designed to be an educator. It's designed as an adult source of entertainment. It was never intended to be an educator. It's never, it's fantasy, it's extreme, it's entertainment. it's about entertaining people. Same way that you wouldn't put a kid down and tell them to watch Fast and the Furious to learn how to drive. It's fictional and it's fantasy and it's fun and it's exciting, but it's not real life. Yes, some people have sex like that. But sorry, what was your question again?
Is it a good educational tool, and is it how most people learn or they get their sexual education?
I think it's not a good educational tool for young people, definitely. I mean, there are good things that people can learn from it. Say for a lot of young LGB people, who are kind of exploring their sexuality, a lot of them would say that they use porn to sort of figure out who they're attracted to, and that kind of reinforce or help them to feel more comfortable in kind of their sexual attraction and their sexual preferences. But then on the other hand, there's it gets so varied. It's so difficult to say, okay, it teaches this and it doesn't teach this. But like there are some basics that you need, when it comes to being not just a good sexual partner, but just having kind of good sexual values. Like respect for yourself and your partner, understanding of autonomy, having, good boundaries, having good communication skills. You don't get any of that in porn, and that's not porn's fault, but it's definitely not the place to be learning about those things, because they're the basis of every sexual interaction that you have, with regardless of how many people you have sex with, whatever sexual behaviors that you do, that good solid grounding needs to be there. And people just aren't really being educated about that until maybe TY fifth year in Ireland. Like we need to be learning about consent, about sexual boundaries, about sexual pleasure, about sexual functioning at a way earlier age, so people know what's normal for themselves, and I suppose they know how to kind of have healthy sexual relationships. But if they're relying on porn, they're not going to get that information.
Yeah, it wasn't built for that purpose as an education tool.
Yeah, exactly. Like, it gets a bad rap. I mean, some porn is really bad. It is. But a lot of porn is just porn. It's really silly. It's like really dramatic and kind of funny.
Yeah, completely not reality at all.
Yeah. So
what is some of the like sexual education work you've done or you're currently doing to help people learn more about sex?
So yeah, as I was saying, I started off working in sex ed, going around to schools, and we had like a 3-workshop program that did everything from kind of puberty and reproduction all the way up to body image and sending nudes, discussing porn, all of those different things. But at the moment, I'm working with the active consent program, and they deliver sexual consent interventions in universities and secondary schools. And yeah, I suppose it's great now to see that there are so many more options available in Ireland when it comes to, all of these like educational interventions that are available. A lot of people are doing fantastic research and fantastic intervention development work. But that's all really new, like none of this is available. I don't know what age you are, but like, as you said, you had terrible sex education. So when you were in school, there was nothing. When I was in school, there was nothing. And it used to just be scare tactics, like, oh, well, if you have unprotected sex, or if you have sex at all, you'll get pregnant, or you'll get this big disgusting STI and show you a big scary infected penis picture. So thankfully, it's developed a huge amount over the last couple of years, and policy and legislation that's being implemented now. Like, people are really starting to understand the importance of this, and it's not just good enough to say, don't have sex, wait till you're married. It's so interesting, isn't it, that we like expect children and teenagers to be completely asexual, and then the second they turn into adults, then now we expect them to be completely sexually competent and to be able to communicate with their sexual partners and to know how to be respectful and to have good sex and whatever, when we haven't given them the foundation at all. So I think that we're seeing a significant change as a country, and I'm kind of proud of Ireland in that we've changed quite quickly in that sense. For a really long time, this was a very, very Catholic, very religious country. The Catholic Church had control over our education systems. So it's only very recently, that we've changed from discussing, sex between two men as a sin, to where we are now. So we have to kind of give ourselves a pat on the back to a certain extent, to be like, look, we're not perfect yet, but really we've come on leaps and bounds, and people are doing their best. And I think you can really see that now. If you talk to parents, they really understand the importance of talking to their kids about, their bodies, and being safe, and respecting one another, and that kind of thing. And all of that information lays the foundation then for having these more kind of complex conversations about relationships or sexual intimacy down the line. And yeah, I think people are doing it really well now.
Yeah, thankfully, yeah. I remember hearing that, I think it's the American Psychological Association had people who were gay or lesbian as like a psychological condition up until like the 70s. It was like a diagnosed condition, and now it's like the same-sex marriage in Ireland, which is great,
Yeah, no, oh yes, sure. It was, I think, yeah, it was in the DSM as a psychological problem. It was illegal to be gay, I think, up until like 83 or something in Ireland. Was it 93? Oh God, I have to double check that. But relatively recently.
Yeah, I feel like it might have been the 90s.
Yeah, maybe I'm thinking maybe 1993. I don't know. I'll have to double check.
Yeah. So just playing devil's advocate. So we talked off air about someone was pushing back against the work you were doing with kids. So let's say, for example, they're like, you shouldn't be teaching kids about sex when they're young. What would they be missing out on? What are the benefits to learning about sex when you're younger? Like, why should kids learn about sex when they're, let's say, under 18?
Loads of reasons. But I suppose, some people's arguments would be that this is like really kind of archaic attitude or belief that if you start talking to teenagers about sex, oh, well, then they're just going to go out and have sex. But we know that that's not true, because in countries where they've had like really detailed, comprehensive sex education all through primary school and secondary school, they actually have the lowest numbers of early sexual initiation, teen pregnancies. So say in Holland, they get their sex education the whole way through school. Their age of consent is actually way younger than us. It's age 13. But people have sex for the first time later than they do on average than we do in Ireland. Does that make sense? So people in Holland have sex at a later age than people in Ireland do.
Is that relative to the age of consent, or just across the board?
Across the board. So in Ireland, the average age is, I think, 17 for first time sex. First time penetrative sex, I know that's very limited understanding of sexual behavior, but when it comes to like penis and vagina sex, just for example, it's 17, but in Holland it's 18. So people actually, when they have all of this information, they can make these decisions, and they don't feel as pressured to have sex. Like I remember growing up, there was so much pressure to be sexually active, or to like, first of all, so much pressure to like kiss somebody, and then to do this and do this. And it was like a tick the box thing. You're like, okay, now thank God I've done this thing. How far have you gone? Whereas in a country that actually really understands sex, and they don't see it as this sort of badge of honor, it's just something that will happen if you wanted to, when you're in a relationship with somebody that you really like them or whatever, or not even if you're in a relationship. So that whole idea, that old trope of, oh, well, if you talk to kids about sex, then they're going to go out and have it. No, they're not. And we can see that, through examples like that. But there's so many benefits to talking about sex. From a very young age, it protects children, so say, even not even talking about sex, but calling, different parts of the body the correct name. So calling, the vulva a vulva, or a vagina, or whatever you want to call it, calling, penis a penis, then there's no ambiguity about what that is. And children can, and if they're not embarrassed about talking about that part of their body, then if they were ever in a situation, where they might potentially be exploited or something, they are a lot more capable at, speaking about that, using the correct language. But also, God, I mean, there are advantages in every way. Like, as I was saying there, it's not, you don't just become sexual when you get married or when you turn 18. A lot of people have sexual desire all the way throughout their lives. like peaking, you know, or I suppose starting to become more aware of it during their teenage years. And just because they're not meant to have sex at that age doesn't mean that they're not going to. And if you don't give them any information, then you're running into all of these risks, you know, where people are having babies, where they're, you know, too young to support them financially, emotionally. It makes, you know, make a really significant change to their own life, where they might be able to finish school. So like if somebody's educated, they have all the information they need, they can be responsible. And, you know, there's nothing, what's I gonna say? Like it's not up to us to, it doesn't make any sense to be like, okay, once somebody is 18, now they have all of the, you know, now they're emotionally mature enough to have sex. Because I know 26-year-olds who you mightn't think are emotionally mature, you know. So I think we need to give teenagers a lot more, what's the word? They're really bright, and they need to be given a lot more credit. They need to be, you know, they're not adults yet, they're still minors, they're still children, but they can be equipped with this knowledge. We can talk to them about all of these things. Yes, might not be ready to use it yet, but it doesn't mean that we can't give them this information now, and, you know, let them think about it and let them discuss it with their friends, rather than kind of expecting somebody to be a great sexual partner and to have all of these great sexual values and boundaries and be a, you know, perfect person when they become an adult. It's just unrealistic.
Yeah, of course. You can't just learn it overnight, or in a relationship it might be kind of like too late. Well, not too late, but it just mightn't be the right time. So what's the kind of like the typical amount of sexual education that people get up to the age 18? Is there like, I know you're doing some work, so you can talk about that as well, but is it like very, you know, for example, I can't remember any really. So like, is that the norm, or we'll talk about Ireland or America or wherever you want to go, but is it typically that people get none, or is there some, or what's the state of affairs?
It really depends. I mean, Ireland is actually quite liberal when it comes to sex education. Yes, there are still some schools where, you know, they're not given that much detail, but it's part of our curriculum anyway to cover puberty and reproduction, contraception and STIs, which is really limited. And, you know, when it mostly just kind of talks about sex from a harm reduction perspective. But, you know, in other countries, you know, I was doing like a week of guest lecturing in Zagreb in Croatia a couple of years ago, and they have no sex education at all. I was really shocked to hear that. It's still a very Catholic country. And then obviously, I'd say most countries around the world don't have comprehensive sex ed. We're really lucky in Europe, you know, Europe, Australia, New Zealand, parts of America are good, but then, you know, in conservative states, there's no sex education at all, and they would advocate for, you know, there'd be a lot of abstinence only programs. And what's interesting is that teen pregnancy is actually higher in the states where they use abstinence only interventions. So they don't work. You know, people need to know how to use condoms, and yeah, I can't believe we kind of still have to have this conversation, because in my mind I'm like, God, come on, it's not a big deal, you know, that like people it's just part of being a human. It's mad that this is the one thing to survive on this planet. We need to have sex, and people need to know about it at an earlier age. Oh, I've got a second cat coming in here now. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, it's like if you want to get kind of, I don't know, philosophical about it, it's like some people say the meaning of life is to reproduce. And if you think it's like, if it's that important, our whole, you know, reason to be alive is just to produce. And then you think about how much we know about that, and how much there's guidelines, education. It's very scary. It's like, what the hell is going on? How did the disconnect come about, you know? So
yeah, like now, well, we need to have sex to reproduce, but like we have, it's, you know, it's part of our anatomy. You know, like pleasure is inbuilt in us as well. And yeah, for some people, they kind of just gotten around the kind of discomfort of talking about sex for reproduction. But like, we're meant to experience pleasure as well. You know, there's nothing wrong with it. It's literally innate. So why is this something that we still feel so awkward about? It's interesting though, you know, like some countries are so comfortable talking about sexuality, and they'd be, you know, really comfortable walking around naked in front of each other and things like that. We haven't got quite there yet in Ireland. But the Irish weren't always like this. So I think it was like pagans were like really sexually liberated, and they used to have like all of these like big like sex festivals and things like that. It was really celebrated. And then when the Catholic Church came into Ireland, that's when things really changed. Sorry, being walked on here.
And yeah, so what effect do you think the Catholic Church has had on sex and sexual education in Ireland?
Oh God, are we going there?
Well, we don't have to. We can avoid. We'll skip
No,
over.
we can.
We don't want to offend anybody, but
No, like, I mean, well, obviously, you know, they had so much power for such a long time, and they had a hand in our education, our healthcare, our government, and how the country was run. So there's literally no part of our lives that wasn't touched by the Catholic Church for so long. And what really sickens me though is that they, you know, for a lot of people, yeah, they would make these like claims about, you know, morally corrupt women who have sex outside of marriage, and who ended up being put in like in Magdalene laundries and things like that. But they, you know, they like hid all of this like terrible abuse under the veil of piety. Like, oh no, we're above it all, when they were actually, it was so insidious what they did. And there's so many people in Ireland who've grown up, you know, having been abused by priests and being abused by their family members, being abused in general, you know. But it's just, maybe actually this is going to get a bit heavy. I don't know if we should go there, and we can edit this out. But because there were so many strict rules around the type of sex that you could have, and that was sort of instilled by the Catholic Church. You know, you can only have sex is between a man and a woman when they're married. So for a long time, any normal or natural feelings that people had when it came to sex or masturbating or whatever, they would feel so much shame because it didn't align with Catholic teaching. And that we've carried that shame through generations. You know, it doesn't just go. How our parents felt, or how our grandparents felt about sex, and how ashamed or embarrassed, or however they felt about it, they would have passed on some of that to their kids. So our parents, they would have passed on some of their maybe insecurities, or, you know, hang-ups or beliefs or whatever about sex to us as well. And it's up to us now, I feel anyway, to right a lot of those wrongs, you know, to start having these conversations at an earlier age, to make it more of a normalized thing to talk about sex. And, you know, just because we normalize talking about sex, it doesn't mean that you have to go around talking about your sex life to everybody, but it just means that you have the knowledge and the information and the kind of skill that you are able to effectively communicate with future partners, and then you know what you want for yourself, so you don't feel under pressure to participate in things that you don't want to do.
Yeah, you're aware of what you're doing. And I feel like what you're just after saying is, it proves the point that the abstinent first approach doesn't work, because it's like, I feel like Irish history is just a point to prove all of that. You know, it just does not work. And if anything, it actually rebounds and blows back in your face a lot worse than being more open to talking about it like you're trying to be, and just normalizing talking about sex. But yeah, it's, I guess, on the younger generations to kind of like change and talk about it more. But
yeah, and like we are seeing that, you know, like what's even really interesting is that people are just so much more accepting and like embracing of difference. But for such a long time, it was, oh, you're weird if you do anything outside of the norm. When it comes to sexuality, I think the internet has helped, you know, to break down some of those barriers as well, because you can literally access whatever you're interested in, and, you know, like OnlyFans or whatever, people have a lot more kind of ownership over the content that they might choose to sell. You know, that sort of reduces the excessive exploitation in the sex industry as well. So yeah, there's you know, it's a complicated time that we live in, but I think it's an interesting time as well, because we're starting to see a lot of these cultural changes. But at the same time, you know, just because we're seeing changes, you know, positive changes in my eyes, it doesn't mean that we can't revert back to old ways. You know, we're seeing that in, say, in America at the moment. You know, they're trying to reverse Roe versus Wade. You're trying to kind of ban abortion again, or outlaw abortion. So just because we make all of these legislative changes and people's attitudes begin to change, it doesn't mean that we can't go back the way as well. So I think it's important that we keep having these conversations and keep the dialogue open then.
Yeah, it's absolutely crazy. It's like we give women more right, and then it's like, no, actually, we're going to take that back now. And it's like, where's the research to say that's like an effective approach, or where's the logic? It's just like, I'm not comfortable with that, so we're going to take it back. And it's very bizarre.
And that's it. Yeah, that's it. There's, you know, there's no research showing, well, like, I suppose, you know, limiting people from getting an abortion, it doesn't mean that they're going to just stop trying to get one. So a lot of the time, people who don't have access to abortion centers or whatever nearby, or can't get it to their GP, you know, they'll go online to get tablets, and that can be really dangerous. But yeah, it's kind of interesting now that we have abortion in Ireland, after I kind of felt like we might never get there.
Yeah, it's very scary to think, like, if people want to do it and they know it's available. Like, I had a friend growing up who like flew over to England. It's like, to get it done.
Oh,
it's
yeah.
Like, yeah, that kind of thing is really sad, because it's like, you know, it's really their body to make a choice with. And I don't know, we'll go off the deep end here talking about this, but yeah, just, it's kind of sad to get what seems like, I don't want to say a basic medical procedure, but like, just, it should be common to all, and it's not. And it's just sad to think that they have to go to England when it could be done here.
I know, yeah, and people are still, you know, still having to go abroad or to order tablets online. So if you think about it, Irish communities, a lot of them are really closely knit. So some people are still really concerned about going to their GP and having to get, you know, like termination prescriptions, or, you know, the tablets and stuff that you would take, because they're worried that that person might relay that information to somebody that they know. And so we still have a lot of barriers to get over, for sure.
Yeah. So speaking of overcoming barriers, you had your TED Talk trying to educate the people. So can you talk a little bit about what your TED Talk was covering, and the topics that were involved in that?
Yeah. So that was a couple of years ago now. So it was really just about talking about how we can try to kind of make sex a little bit more normal, you know, like, how can we make it a bit more acceptable to talk about it, and make people kind of feel more comfortable having conversations about sex. And yeah, God, I haven't actually thought about it now in so long. What's funny is that I've never watched it, because I hate watching myself present. So I just have, I think I watched like the first 2 minutes and I was just cringing, so I couldn't go back and watch it. I'd love to do another one and talk about porn, and like how we need to stop blaming porn for everything, because we do. Oh my God, we just blame anything that happens, so it's porn's fault, if porn was involved in any way. So I would like to do something on that. But yeah, like, I suppose a lot of what I would have talked about in my TED Talk was, you know, getting parents to kind of prompt conversations with their kids, for example, because I think parents have this idea that, oh, if a kid, you know, if they have a question, they're going to ask me. That's not true. You know, if it's about sex, they're going to be embarrassed, and because they've learned to be embarrassed, they've learned that there's a bit of a funny topic, so they shouldn't ask about it. A lot of kids feel as well that they worry that if they ask their parents about sex, their parents are going to think that they're having sex because they want to have sex, and that's not the case at all. So a lot of it was kind of trying to prompt parents to kind of to develop the language and the kind of confidence to talk to their kids about it, because the earlier you start, then the better it'll be in the long run. And it, you know, I think sometimes parents think about having conversations about sex as being really daunting. And yes, it might be daunting if you're going from 0 to 100. So if you've never had a conversation, now all of a sudden you want to talk about porn, for example, that's a big change. But if you're starting off, just talking about relationships and like normal healthy boundaries to do with yourself, then the conversations that follow that can be so much easier. But it's lots of little conversations rather than one big the talk that a lot of people would kind of talk about. Yeah,
it's built up into that talk as if it's like open and shut. We just have this one conversation, you're going to learn
everything you need to know.
It's like at 15 or 18 or whatever age, you're going to learn it all, but you still have like whatever 60, 50 years of life left after. And that one conversation is going to carry you through all those years. Yeah. So just in the consent report you have, sorry, my phone just went off randomly. So in the consent report it said 63% of males and 71% of females, they were dissatisfied with sexual education they received. So is that something that is like, so since that report, is that something that's still the case? Are people like still dissatisfied with the level of sexual education they receive from your experience? Or
yeah, like it's hard. Sex education's definitely gotten better, but there seems to be like a small percentage of schools that are really trying to up their game, and to teach really good comprehensive sex ed. But there's still loads of schools who get barely any. So I'd say a lot of people are still not happy with the sex ed that they get. But it's very difficult as well to be able to answer every question that a young person has. For a lot of young people, the anonymous frequently asked questions that we get, a lot of them will be about like, how do you do X? How do you do Y? And that's not information that we can give somebody. We can't be like, oh, well, you do this and then you do that. And we tell them that it's all about communicating with your partner. And for a lot of people, that's a bit of like an anticlimactic answer. You're just like, oh, that doesn't really answer my question. So I think that there are, people will probably go to porn to learn, say, about behavioral things if they're not being taught in sex education, or if they're not getting that information elsewhere. And they just then need to know, they need to have enough information that they realize that what they see in porn might not be reflective of what their partner might want in the future or what they have to do. I think people might often, there's the same sort of behaviors in porn. They start off doing like oral sex, and then they go to vaginal sex, and they go to anal sex. And people kind of think that this might be like the template to sex. So this is how you do sex. And then it might be feeling like really worried about having to, have anal sex or whatever. So they just need to know that although they might see those things, they need to have the skills to kind of think critically about it and to acknowledge that, okay, it's okay to, decide what I want to do sexually when I'm ready, and to kind of talk about it, to have those basic communication skills so that they can discuss it with their partner. But I'd say, unfortunately, a lot of people are still going to be unhappy with their sex ed. There are some great programs, and we're really starting now to, consent has come to the forefront, and when it's actually, from a top-down position, like from government, are really getting behind rolling out consent education workshops and classes in schools, and that's a huge step forward. So it's great to see all of these changes.
Yeah, as in, I guess that's why there was the need for the whole consent report. So could you just talk a little bit about consent, why you needed to do a report on it, and is that an acronym, or is that just, it's the SMART consent report? So
SMART was an acronym, and I cannot remember for the life of me what it stood for. It was really long, and I think we kind of scratched that in the end. So yeah, the SMART consent workshop was how it started, and now we're called the Active Consent Program. So we do the workshops and all of these kind of large scale surveys. So we had to do the sexual experience survey because there were like anecdotally lots of people reporting assaults, like 1 in 4 women, 1 in 10 men, and those findings are reflected in our data as well. But we wanted to see how consent, or kind of attitudes towards consent, were associated with those experiences. And I suppose we kind of needed to see how many people had like positive or kind of problematic attitudes when it comes to consent or rape myths, so that we can use that information then to develop interventions, to give people accurate information about what consent is. Because I think when you ask somebody what consent is, they would say, oh, it's giving someone permission to do something sexual or whatever. But it's not that straightforward. It's not black and white. It can be ambiguous, especially when you bring drugs and drink into the situation. So it's really the workshops that we're doing now is really giving people the space to think about the type of kind of situations where consent might be a bit blurred, and how to I suppose how to do the right thing in those situations, and how to seek support, if things go wrong, or how to intervene if you see somebody acting inappropriately, and things like that. But also, it's mainly about giving people the confidence to communicate with their partner, but also an understanding that people perceive consent cues differently. What I might think is, oh yeah, that person's really coming on to me, somebody else mightn't see it in that way at all. So it's about being, like on the active consent program, it's all about trying to share the message that you need to be really, really clear in your intentions. And then hopefully that way there won't be any ambiguity, because it's in those ambiguous situations, those kind of gray areas, where things can go wrong.
Yeah, so I attended one of those workshops when I was in NUI, and I found it very useful, and that's kind of what led me to have this episode. What are some of the things that you try and teach the participants in the consent workshop, or you try to get across to them by the end of the workshops?
Okay, so we start off trying to explore where students' understanding of consent really, and we have a really helpful acronym. Consent is OMFG, so consent is ongoing, mutual, and freely given. So ongoing in that it's continuous, so just because you consent at the beginning doesn't mean that you can't retract it, and that you have to kind of constantly check in with your partner to see if they're doing okay. That it's mutual, that both people are into it, and that it's freely given, so it hasn't been coerced. You haven't been kind of pestering somebody to such an extent that they eventually give in. So as long as consent is OMFG, we start off with that. And then using that model, that consent is OMFG, we get people to read these short stories or vignettes, and they have, they might have like two guys who are hooking up, or a guy and a girl, or whoever in a story. And we get the students to work in small groups to read the stories together and to identify whether or not they thought that was a consensual story. And what was interesting is you usually see a gender difference in how those stories are interpreted. That guys usually think, I think it's like 66% of guys in one of the stories, and only 40% of girls thought that the story was consensual. Now I'd have to kind of read the story out to you, but it's just interesting to see that there is that discrepancy there. That guys might be more likely to think that there was a sexual intention there than girls. Now that's not it across the board, but it's these kind of points that we get the participants to reflect on. That the way that you interpret something doesn't necessarily mean that other people see it the same way. And then we challenge some social norms about sex. So we get people to sort of think about what are the social norms activities that we do. I'm trying to think of, we use some of our data. So we kind of read out some statements about, the importance of consent, and whether or not people believe that statement might be true. Like, okay, I think consent is important, and we might ask them then, do you think other people think consent is important? And usually people score high on the first question, so they would say, yeah, I think consent is really important, but a lot of them would think that their peers might think it's as important as they do. So it's about challenging this idea of, like, okay, yeah, I think consent's important, but I'm not going to speak up and talk about it because I don't want to be considered weird, because my pals might talk about it or whatever. Whereas really everyone thinks it's important. So it's just about kind of normalizing the discussion of consent and giving people that kind of empowerment and confidence to know, like, oh no, actually I am right, and I am doing the right thing, when I'm kind of concerned about being very clear when it comes to sexual communication. So that's the intervention really in a nutshell, but it's growing arms and legs. Oh my god, we have theater performances now that depict different consensual scenarios, and that's, we use that as an educational resource as well. I'm doing kind of sexual media stuff and how consent is portrayed like in porn and on TV. We're doing workshops in schools. It's just, yeah, it's ever growing. We need a bigger team. We've got loads going on.
Yeah, I'd imagine. And that difference, the 60-40% between guys and girls, that shows the need. If it's not the same, it shows the need for consent.
100%.
And you hear, I don't know how would you describe, maybe like a myth, or that asking for consent kind of kills the mood. Is like that. I feel as though it's like, the question I would ask is like, what's the downside to asking for consent? And it's like, then everyone's on the same playing field then. Is that something that you hear from participants or people in the workshops, that it kills the mood?
Yeah, like that is something that people would say, like, oh yeah, well, I don't want to ask for consent because it, might ruin the mood. But if it ruined the mood, then the other person really didn't want to have sex in the first place. So if I think a lot of people are afraid of being rejected, but I'm sure people will be more afraid of being accused of assault, so it's really just about normalizing that it's okay to ask, because you don't want to be like most people who get involved in, who are charged with sexual assaults or sexually violent behavior. They didn't intend to go out and assault somebody. But it's this lack of communication, a change in behavior when they're drinking, not understanding boundaries, pushing things too far, not understanding that their coercive behavior is coercive, taking advantage of people when they're drinking. So there's loads of stuff going on there that people, you don't associate that with your sort of stereotypical understanding of what a rapist is, like someone who jumps out from an alley at nighttime, that's kind of how we think about it, but it's actually a lot more subtle than that. And unfortunately, it's these subtleties that people just don't kind of might not consider them to be as important. But yeah, so I guess what we're getting at in our interventions or the consent workshops is we're raising awareness around like, okay, how are lots of different factors, how can they lead to ambiguities, and how can we counteract those?
Yeah, it just gives certainty to the situation when it's needed. And as I've gotten older, I've talked to more friends and women especially about sexual assault, and it's like, I would have thought growing up, oh, it doesn't happen, or it's very rare, or you would know the type of person that does it, and it's like, not at all. It's like, who's gonna open up and talk about it, or it's just, it isn't talked about at all. So what are like the rates of assault? Do you know by any chance, like, is there research on that?
Yeah, well, so our study, that the sexual experiences survey there, Dr. Lorraine Burke spearheaded that, and it was the rest of our team and Padraig McNeela. We all co-wrote the report. I think it was 1 in 4. Yeah, 1 in 4 female students and 1 in 10 male students, and I think 1 in 4 non-binary students. Now that's at college, where there's a lot of drinking, a lot of sex, a lot of socializing. So that's not reflective of the population. But the statistics overall, from really massive international studies, is 1 in 4 will be assaulted in their lifetime.
That's crazy. That's so sad.
It's crazy. And it's really, what's even sadder is that we are still living in a society where victims are blamed, that they feel like they can't come forward, that they feel like they're going to be judged, and that they don't get the adequate support. So that's why I really like, that's why I'm staying in this line of work, because it's such a serious issue that has such, physical and psychological implications on people. And we need to stop it. It needs to stop. So the more we talk about it, I think the more guys talk about it as well is really important, especially like within their friend groups, because oftentimes you might hear of situations going on where, a guy might be, or not even just a guy, but like a person might be kind of maybe getting with somebody who's really, really drunk, and it's the friends who can step in and who can do something can do something about it, can, really be the game changers there. But it's so promising now to see guys speaking up about it, and taking this sort of like no tolerance approach, and like even the little things, like subtle things, like maybe calling their friend out if they make like a rape joke or something like that, because it's systemic. It starts out, might just be this small, one person might think like, oh, it's just a rape joke. It's not that big of a deal, but it's all of these little things that normalize how we treat people. And I think guys have a huge role to play in this. So it's great to see like guys like yourself, who are interested in like hosting podcasts and talking about it and bringing up these issues.
Yeah. It's funny you should mention calling people out. So sort of randomly, I was watching the Hardy Books. I don't know if you've heard of those, the comedians.
Yeah.
And there was a sketch where all the lads are just around, just talking, joking or whatever. And then some guy basically kind of insinuates that he had non-consensual sex. And I don't know if you know the character Boo. This guy's image was blurred on the screen as well, which is very like sketchy. But anyway, the Boo is like, wait, hold on a minute now. He's like, let me get that clear. Is this what you're saying? It was non-consensual. And I was like, whoa, this is the Hardy Books episode is from like 10 years ago. So I was like,
oh, wow.
I doubt that he intended or they intended to be kind of talking about that, but it happened. I was like, very like, he's completely doing the right thing. It's really awkward. The guy is kind of like, oh, no, I didn't mean it like that or whatever. And it's like, yeah, no, it's a good conversation. It's a good thing he called him out. And
oh, wow. Okay. I'll have to go and find that actually.
I'll send it on after, yeah, but it was very interesting to see. And only for that I'm kind of more aware now that I'm older and I've talked more about it. It's like, oh yeah, I noticed it, Whereas I'd watched that episode years ago and probably never thought much of it.
Yeah, it was the same in like loads of movies. What was I watching recently? Oh, Star Wars, like one of the first Star Wars. And yeah, there's just like so many examples now when you start thinking in this way, you see it everywhere. That like the guy, he like forces himself on somebody, but they portray it in this like really romantic way. He's like, oh, he just really loved her, when he's actually just forced himself on her. There's so many examples like that from Hollywood. God, it's
or even that women want that. They want a guy to force themselves on them. I don't know where that comes from. And it's like, maybe because it's such a male dominated world that we live in. And it's like, I don't know, it doesn't sound consensual to me if that's what's happening.
Yeah. Like that's kind of what the sexual media intervention that I'm developing, the online intervention for teenagers, we're kind of tapping into a lot of how the media portray all of these things. It's so damaging. The like glorifying of like sexual coercion. Like even one example I thought that we came across when we were developing it was from The Notebook. And like there's this scene from The Notebook that's considered to be like so romantic and so like, oh, he's really wearing his heart in his sleeve and like showing her how much he loves her and wants to be with her. But the girl in it, Ali, she's like on a Ferris wheel with another guy on it. She's on a date, and Noah, who fancies her, Ryan Gosling, he runs up and grabs onto the Ferris wheel while it's running, while it's going, and they're like in the middle of the air, and he's hanging from the bar, like in front of where the people are sitting, and being like, look, if you don't go, like I really want you to go on a date with me. And she was like, are you crazy? Like, get down. And he was just like, let's go of one arm, and he was just like, oh, please, like basically coercing her into going on a date. And if she doesn't, he's threatening to kill himself, basically, to let himself drop to the ground from the Ferris wheel and crush his body and die. And that's considered, like, when we think about like romance movies, and we think about that scene as being really romantic, when it's actually so problematic. It's so coercive. But it's interesting in how film and media, they can just present something in such a way that makes you go like, oh, isn't that lovely? Oh, he really likes her. Whereas actually like really sending a bad message, and we see that all over the place. It's not just porn doing these kind of things.
Yeah, celebrating a very inappropriate way to behave. It's like, what I feel like women would never do that. They're way more sensible than us guys, and like it's almost normal for a guy to do something like that. And it's like, when you look at it you take a step back and you look at it, you're like, that's clearly the wrong way to, I guess, try and go on a date with somebody. But for some reason, it's almost accepted or promoted. It's very bizarre.
No, it's beyond me. It's for another day.
Yeah. So just going back to what you currently do in your research, is there anything you're currently working on or coming up that you want to speak about?
So the study that I just published there, I was kind of I'm probably going to be doing like a good bit of like media stuff about that after Christmas. And that was we developed a measure to assess what young adults report learning about sex from porn. So I'm kind of interested in that, and looking at, well, what are the associations with that? So like, okay, if you say you learn a lot about what genitals look like, or about sexual technique, or about sexual exploration from porn, what are the implications of that? And that's the kind of route that I'd like to go down in the future. But I'm also really interested in there's a huge increase in sexual choking going on in consent. So what started as consensual sex, and then usually the male partner, starting to choke his partner during sex. More than likely this is happening because people are seeing it on porn, because people certainly, like, that might be a practice, say, in BDSM community, and lots of people aren't learning it through that. So I'm kind of interested in looking at this huge increase in choking behavior, because it's certainly something that people aren't discussing. It's really dangerous. There are ways to do it safely, but loads of people are just kind of watching porn and thinking, oh, okay, choking something that might, it's kind of taboo, it's sort of kinky, maybe my partner will like it. But then they're accidentally putting loads of pressure here at the front of the neck, and the partner can pass out. It's being used as a defense now in lots of kind of sex gone wrong murder cases. So I'm kind of interested in looking at that as well. Problem with me is that I'm interested in too many things, so I don't want to be doing loads of projects at one time. So yeah, I'm once this contract ends now, I'll have to have a good think about which direction I want to go in next.
Yeah, I know the feeling. I'm starting off doing a health podcast, and I'm talking about sexual health, and I'll be talking about nutrition or mental health, and yeah, it's all over the shop. But it all ties in. So how does sexual education, sexual health, consent, how does it all tie into your mental health? Like, as in, does it have a big impact, small impact? What are your thoughts on that?
I suppose it's kind of cyclical in that, like, your mental health is going to, so like, if you're struggling with your mental health, you're going to struggle in lots of other aspects of your life as well. So like your sexual functioning might be influenced, you mightn't be able to feel aroused, or to like engage in intimacy with your partner. And again, like, if you're struggling with your sexual health, if you're really struggling with an issue in your sex life, that might impact your mental health. You might feel bad about it, because you might feel like embarrassed or ashamed or whatever. You might feel less of a man or less of a woman because you can't have an orgasm or whatever. There's all of these things kind of tied into each other. Sex and mental health are hugely correlated. There's loads of studies that show, like, if you're if you've high sexual satisfaction, that your mental health levels are higher as well. So people who have more orgasms generally are happier. Now, sex isn't all about orgasms, but if it's it definitely helps. If you're having orgasms, it definitely helps your mental health as a stress reliever. And normally, I suppose, because as a society we place so much emphasis on sex and relationships, so that you should be having good sex. I think this doesn't help, if people are going through a phase where they're having bad sex, they're not enjoying it, or they've kind of gone through a lull, or things aren't going well with their partner, and then that can kind of feed into how they feel mentally as well. So that, there's positives and negatives, like in anything really. Same as, we were talking before the interview, like, that certain things can happen in your sexual experience, like you can experience something sexually that might have a really negative outcome on your mental health. But then you might experience something sexually that makes you kind of reawaken a certain aspect of yourself that is really, really positive to your mental health. So they're all related.
Yeah, for sure. So then if someone wanted to learn more about, sex or consent, or maybe how it ties in with their mental health, like, what are some of the resources available to people, in Galway and I guess around the world?
There's loads of resources. If you first want to look up anything to do with like consent or any of the research that we're doing in NUIG, go to the active consent, I think at NUI Galway, and you'll find all of our stuff there. But there's loads of stuff online. There's Sexual Health West in Galway City, so they're a charity that do sex education programs. There's loads of people doing, sex ed stuff on Instagram or on TikTok now, on OnlyFans. There's just, you can kind of get any information you want. But it's about, I suppose, going to the good places to get accurate information as well. It's important. There's a really good website for teenagers called Scarlet Teen. So if any teenagers or parents are listening, that's a really good place to go. But yeah, keep an eye on kind of updates from us anyway. We're usually, if we launch any new programs, there'll be something about it in the news or in like newspaper articles or on the radio. So I'll try to keep you up to date on those. But there's the Kinsey Institute, like there's so much stuff. You could probably go down a rabbit hole. But what I can do actually is send you on a list of resources and links afterwards that you can maybe attach to this.
Yeah, that'd be perfect. I was going to say, is there anywhere you want to point people to?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll do that. No problem.
Brilliant. Is there anything you didn't mention that you want to cover or speak about before we wrap up?
I don't think so. No, I'm good. How about you?
No, this is just very informative and good to know that there's a lot of science behind it, and that you're doing like very important work. And I think a lot of people will learn from it, because it's pretty hard to talk about, but it's needed.
Exactly. Yeah, I agree. No, thanks so much for having me.
Great, Kate. Thanks very much.